So thank you so much for having me here. So this is basically what I was planning to say first. So my name is Reguant, and I'm at the GSB. I have a background in economics. So today we'll be talking about climate change policy and how to think about climate change policy through the lens of economics. I teach at the MBA and also a PhD class on energy and natural resources, again through the lens of economics. So my research topics, what I do mostly is work on electricity markets, so how we design electricity markets, how can we integrate renewable technologies into these electricity markets. And then in terms of climate change policy and climate change regulation, I work on cap and trade. What are the static and dynamic effects of alternative cap and trade climate change policy designs? And then also looking at actual data. So I work a lot with data. So looking at actual data, how to test, how to understand how firms respond to these climate change policies. Okay, how do firms respond to cap and trade? Today I wanted to give you an overview on climate policy from an economics perspective. So as you know, there are several initiatives to curb greenhouse gases, and some of them take the form of a cap and trade program. So all of you are familiar with what a cap and trade program is here? Yes? This is a no? Okay, good. I thought it would be too preliminary, but it's good that I have some to explain. So for those of you who do not know, cap and trade means that we put a target on the emissions that we want to achieve. And anything beyond that will not be allowed. So how do we get there? A cap and trade mechanism does it through the perspective of market-based. Okay, so there's a market where there are permits to emit, to contaminate, to pollute, and firms can trade these permits to pollute. But what we make sure is that there are only as many permits as emissions we are targeting, okay? So the cap is how many emissions we allow. The trade is because we allow people to trade for that amount of emissions, okay? What happens is that in that market-based mechanism, eventually there's a price that determines the equilibrium between how many permits we gave and how much people are willing to pay for it. Another alternative is to directly put a price on those emissions. So instead of putting a cap and letting people trade for those emissions, an alternative is to put a price directly on those emissions, okay? And that would be, for example, used in other settings where we price pollution. There are many settings where firms are paying to pollute, so they pay some environmental taxes for emitting a certain amount of emissions, or also for emitting certain amount of fluids in the rivers. Okay. Another way to address the greenhouse gas challenge is through renewable policies, okay? And most of you must be familiar with several policies that have been trying to increase the amount of renewable energy that we produce, okay? Other ways to regulate pollution more broadly are command and control. For example, by having some standards on how clean power plants should be, how clean an appliance should be, or for example, with energy buildings, with energy codes, how clean a building should be. Okay, so those would be more command and control because they are specific to every installation, to every building, or to every appliance. Okay. So today I want to talk especially about cap and trade and carbon taxes. So how do we think about designing a cap and trade program? How do we think about designing a carbon tax? And from an economics point of view, which one of the two should be better? Okay. I wanted to teach you about this because it's now 40 years that we had a first paper that has been very influential, thinking about whether we should use cap and trade or whether we should use carbon taxes, okay? And that's a paper by Weitzman in 1974, okay? So let me just tell you about this very simple framework. We can think about cap and trade as being a quantity approach. We regulate a particular target of emissions, and we do not allow more emissions from that target. And we can think about the taxes as being a price approach. We put a price on carbon, okay? So how do we choose those prices and quantities? Think about emitting. Why do we pollute? Why do we produce CO2 if we know it's kind of bad for the environment? Well, we do produce CO2 because it does come with benefits, right? When we are driving, we are emitting CO2 for the most part, either directly or indirectly. But we do so because there are benefits from driving, getting to a particular place, right? We can think of the benefits from emissions being very large when we don't emit anything at all. Okay, imagine we are not emitting anything at all. Driving the first mile can be very useful, but eventually as we emit more and more, maybe what we are using the CO2 for is less useful. Okay, so we can think of the benefits from the emissions as decreasing as we pollute more and more. On the contrary, the damages from emissions will tend to increase, right? If we pollute a little bit, maybe nothing happens, but as we start saturating the environment with more and more emissions, then eventually the costs from emissions will increase. When we think about regulating emissions, what we try to find is this sweet spot, where we equalize the damages that come from polluting the environment to the benefits, okay? We cannot afford to cut CO2 to zero, because emitting CO2 does have some benefits, but we want to find this sweet spot in which we equalize the costs to the benefits. One way to do this is by regulating the market with a cap. So we say, okay, this is the most emissions that we should emit, let's put a cap. And as I said, in a cap-and-trade approach, you regulate the cap, and then you let firms decide who will be the ones that will be emitting those CO2 in the air, okay? So we give permits for this cap, and then the firms can trade. Another way to do it is to do an auction. We have an auction, and people can buy these permits. And eventually, in the auction, everyone will come with their share of permits to pollute, okay? However, alternatively, what we could do is just price those emissions. We'll tell to people, okay, you can emit CO2, but as long as you are willing to pay this price. What will happen that the people that need it the most will pay for those emissions, but eventually some of those emissions will not be worth it, and there will be the same amount of greenhouse gas curbing, okay? So this simple framework has prices versus quantities being very nicely equivalent to each other. And that has been used oftentimes in the policy setting to argue that it's the same to have a carbon tax versus a cap-and-trade program. So then it's only a matter of which one is easiest to implement. Okay? The challenge, though, is that with uncertainty, prices versus quantities are not equivalent. Okay? So it might be better to use quantities to put a cap, or it might be better to use prices to price emissions, okay? So the result, as I said, I wanted to bring it up because it's kind of the 40-year anniversary, goes as follows. So Weitzman in 1974 showed that if the marginal social value, the slope of the costs of these emissions, which are social, affect everyone, if this slope is very, very steep compared to the private benefits, what we want to do is to regulate quantities. So what is the intuition? Imagine an ecosystem where there is a certain level of pollution that's bearable, but then very suddenly, after some emissions, we can basically kill the whole ecosystem. This means that the social costs are very steep. We can go from low costs to emissions to very high costs of emissions where we kill the ecosystem. Okay. In that setting, it's very important that we make sure that we don't emit more than that threshold. And therefore, it's better to regulate the quantities. We don't just want to guess a price and hope that we will get the quantity right. Because if we don't get the quantity right, the whole ecosystem might unravel. Okay? Does it make sense? Yes? So when do we want to use prices? We want to use prices when we are pretty certain about the damages being more or less constant. So imagine we are thinking of reducing emissions from CO2, for example. As we know, the cost from those emissions is highly debated. But for example, in the context of California, the emissions that California can curb will have a limited impact on the damage of those emissions, okay? So if we think of a single country, the impact they can have on emissions is still limited, and therefore, in that range, the social cost, the social damage of emissions will not change much. We can think of it as being kind of flat. In that case, we want to use prices, okay? Because we want to remember price the emissions to its social cost. And in this case, if the social cost is more or less flat, we might be confident that we are getting it more or less ballpark right, okay? At least within the range of uncertainty that we are facing. So I wanted to show you this with a graph, okay? So here we have the same as before. We have these damages from emitting, damages from polluting. To be precise, these are marginal damages, so how much it costs to emit an extra ton of CO2. And then there are some private benefits. You can think of the private benefits as being purely benefits, but also think about it as an opportunity cost. If I don't use CO2, what do I need to do? What do I need to pay for, okay? So imagine that these benefits from emitting are kind of uncertain. If we try to get the price and the cap, and we only think about what we expect on average, these are the prices and the caps that we will set. Okay, we equate marginal benefits to marginal costs. However, what happens is that in reality, maybe the marginal benefits, the private benefits from pollution are lower than we expected, or maybe they are higher than we expected. Okay, so imagine they are lower. What will happen ex post is that the price was not right. We had too high of a price. What's even worse is that ex post, actually our cap was too loose. It was too generous. We wanted to have a more stringent cap. Okay, this one here. So what are the costs of having this policy not working quite right? Well, if we think about the cap, what we have is that we have too many emissions, okay? This means that we will have these laws in welfare, okay? We are emitting more at a point at which the benefit does not justify the costs, okay? So the benefits are lower than the costs. I think many of us will agree that this is the current situation, right? Where we think that the benefits of these emissions are not quite on par with the costs. So maybe making them not justifiable, not viable. The price in this setting, you can see that it turned out to be too high. And with this price, we would get even more reductions, okay? So the optimal price would have to be a bit lower. This example, I built it so that you can see that the slope of the social damages is pretty flat compared to this one, okay? This one is kind of flatter than this one. In this case, you can see that the costs of getting the cap wrong were much bigger than the costs of getting the price wrong, okay? And this is exactly what that result was telling us. So when it comes to practice, however, most programs for dealing with greenhouse gas emissions have actually used cap and trade programs. So they have used actually quantities, not prices, even though from this very simple example, it seems that prices maybe would be better. Okay, so what happens when we have the quantity only? Well, when we have the quantity only, the social cost of emissions doesn't play a role, because what the firms see only is their private benefits, okay? So if we let them trade with a given cap, and the private benefits from emissions are pretty steep or pretty uncertain, what can happen is that the prices that we get, it's where this thing crosses the cap, the prices that we can get can be very volatile. So if all of a sudden there is a shock that makes the benefit from emissions low, we could get very low prices. At the same time, if there's another shock that's high, we could get actually very high prices. So the cap and trade mechanism in the context of carbon emissions can actually lead to very volatile prices. Again, through the lens of this simple economic model. So in practice, what we have seen, indeed in the European Union, the EU ETS, this is I think still the largest CO2 program that has come to life, although prices have been high and low. But this covers most countries in the European Union for static sources as well as airplanes. Okay, so in this setting, any static power plant, any static manufacturing plant with a lot of emissions has to have a permit to emit CO2 in the atmosphere. As I mentioned from the previous example, this cap-and-trade setting is good in some instances, but in the case of CO2, it can lead to volatile outcomes. And indeed, this is what has happened. So in the CO2 market in Europe, they started with relatively high prices. They spiked up in 2005, and then they suddenly dropped in 2006. There were some design issues, so the regulators tried to fix that problem and tried to bring prices up. So they renegotiated the program for 2008, but then the crisis hit. So the crisis hitting is something like this guy here, the guy on the very bottom, okay? All of a sudden, there is the economic crisis, and people are not just quite willing to produce. So in that case, prices will also plummet and go very down to zero. These zero prices are a market outcome. It came as a response to the economic crisis, but we know that the social cost of carbon is not zero. So in that sense, it's not achieving an optimal outcome. Okay. If you are interested in how firms responded to this cap-and-trade program, I actually have some work in which we study how the firms actually behaved in the electricity market. So if you are interested, that can be a good reading. What about other markets? So after the, if you wish, scandal of the EU ETS program, these zero prices were not very popular in the climate community. What many cap-and-trade programs did is to put a floor and a ceiling. If we are worried too much about this price volatility, prices being too high, prices being too low, and changing too constantly, what one can do is to say, okay, prices can go down, but they cannot go down to zero. There will be a floor. And one can also prevent prices from spiking by putting a ceiling. Okay? And this is actually what many cap-and-trade programs in the US have done. The RIGI in the Northeast and also the AB 32 in California. In practice, though, we still see very, very low prices. So these floors that have been put in place many times appear to be binding at levels that, again, seem to be below what the social cost of carbon would be. Okay, but again, it's just a way to improve the design, move away from prices versus quantities, and have this hybrid mechanism, okay, where we have a cap, but we also limit the price, okay? If you are interested in the performance of the AB 32, there's this paper by Borenstein, Bushnell, and also Frank Wallach, who's also a professor at Stanford, where they study the volatility of prices in AB 32. And what they show is that even with a floor or a ceiling, a cap-and-trade mechanism can lead to pretty volatile outcomes, okay, pretty volatile prices. So what is wrong with volatile prices? Okay, one thing that's wrong with volatile prices is that they are very uncertain. So the firms have a hard time knowing what the price will be, and therefore have a hard time doing their investments or planning their investments. So many people think maybe a carbon tax would be easier. Okay, so let's talk first about the advantages. So in terms of a carbon tax, it avoids this uncertainty. Okay, it's a price and it's kind of fixed. Yeah, maybe they will change it eventually, but it's much more certain. Okay, so this can be a good thing about prices. Again, remember that in the context of the framework, what we want is to set the tax equal to the social cost of carbon. And a big question is whether we can actually manage to do that. Another thing that's good about carbon taxes is that you don't need to measure emissions from offsets. So when we have this cap, many mechanisms have put in place ways. They have put in place ways to relax the cap by buying offsets. Okay, any of you have bought offsets from their last plane ticket, or You know that sometimes you can buy a forest in the Amazon or you can buy a tree somewhere, okay? Those things will relax the cap. And in many programs, those offsets have actually made the cap and trade program too soft, okay? Because the effective cap with all these offsets has become very, very soft. Okay, so the one thing about taxing is that you only have to make sure you tax emissions. You don't need to assess what is a reduction or what is not an offset. Okay, potentially it can also have lower implementation costs. In practice, though, a carbon tax has not been feasible in most countries. Some have, and some have taken it back, like in Australia, but in practice it's not been very, very feasible. One other thing to worry about taxes, just not to make them shine too much, is that the same way that there are offsets and offsets issues with cap and trade, with taxes there are issues with evasion. So even though you do not worry so much about what qualifies as an offset, what does not qualify as an offset, you still want to make sure that you measure every single emission and you price it. Okay? And then finally, remember that the theory doesn't tell us that the carbon tax is always better. It will only be better when we think that the damages for emissions are more or less within a range. So we're not worried about getting a very particular amount of emissions. Given the particular concentration, the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, you could think that maybe actually we want to push again for a certain level of emissions, okay, instead of just pricing them. And again, these things will not quite be equivalent in the presence of this uncertainty. Now, other issues I wanted to discuss, as you know, the climate change puzzle is not just about how California or how the US should design these cap and trade or tax programs. In reality, there are many constraints that are faced at the international level, and there are many worries about leakage. Leakage means that even if we make lots of efforts to control pollution in a given region, other regions will not have those incentives, okay? So there is a way of solving some of the leakage problems with a border tax adjustment. This means that you also tax the emissions that happen abroad, at least if they are consumed, say, within California or within the US. The problem is that, again, from a legal perspective, some of these things are having a hard time being implemented. Okay. If you are interested in the topic of leakage, I have a paper where we simulate the cement industry, which is a very highly polluting industry in terms of CO2. We simulate how the cement industry would perform under different alternative designs. And we show how the border tax would actually perform well in that setting, but how we can find alternative designs that could work if the border tax adjustment is not politically feasible. Okay, remember always that in this puzzle, it's always what's economically best and also what's politically feasible. Okay, another issue that's very important is the issue of commitment. So many of the solutions to climate change will come from highly intensive capital investments. And again, in the presence of very volatile mechanisms or in the presence of a lack of cooperation, a lack of agreement, the credibility of these policies might be harder. Okay. So, in theory, we want to make it very credible. In practice, political economy, many other constraints, macroeconomic shocks like the 2008 crisis, or all these newfound shale gas will make committing to these carbon policies harder. Okay. Now, for all of these problems, like international cooperation or commitment, a key behind the problem is that there is an incentive compatibility problem. The solutions we have to climate change nowadays, they do not come for free. They come for a cost. Of course, the silver bullet solution would be a technology that breaks through and makes it incentive compatible. This means that everyone wants to jump in and reduce CO2. But this is not where we are at now. Where we are at now, reducing CO2 is costly, and there is a problem of getting everyone on board. Okay. So I just wanted to wrap up with some more comments. Again, I wanted to bring you this framework, a simple economic framework to think about prices versus quantities. For greenhouse gases, as I mentioned, and especially at the local level, like for a single country, carbon taxes seem to be more appropriate within that framework. But as I said, politically, cap and trade has been much easier to implement so far, at least in the US and Europe. As I mentioned, for the global problem, for the global solution, there are some steps moving forward, and I don't know if you listen to the news, but China seems to be ramping up some its pilot cap and trade programs and maybe converging into a national cap and trade program. But there are still many issues with monitoring these emissions, with finding a common ground for an agreement. And again, until we do not have this silver bullet technology that makes reducing CO2 very cheap, we will be still facing all these economic and political challenges with designing greenhouse gas emissions policies. Okay. The framework I present to you is stylized, but it can serve as a framework, as a first best framework to keep in mind, even if regulatorily in practice we will need to give up to many of the aspects that these models will emphasize. So this is what I wanted to present. If you have any questions, I would be very happy to take them. Yes. Okay, good. Yes.
So, what I wanted to ask is, thank you for the great presentation, was the graph you're showing is kind of supply and demand. Two big assumptions. One is that the more money you can a good thing, and two is that social costs can be quantified. And the more money you can a good thing, we could make the debate about, most of the last 30 years is about the 1% globally. And more social costs can be quantified. I kind of wonder how that works in that, say, it might be a lot easier to move a bunch of Afghan families than move one out of Dubai or Nevada, like that. And so my question to you is, what kind of work has been done to do alternative measures? There's all these HDI, DMH, these sorts of things in terms of measuring benefits and measuring costs. So there are alternative things to get away from the dollar, where the dollar and do the measures.
Okay, so in terms of, I guess, let's see. So here, the model does definitely have, I didn't draw it in here, but this model will certainly have uncertainty also on the damages. The bigger the uncertainty, the harder it is to come up with the right range of prices. And this is a big issue. As you know from the IPCC reports, the variance on these forecasts is actually quite large. And there are these fat tails where they predict very, very dismal outcomes, and some others are much more conservative within the range. In this type of settings, when we think about design, what we care is about uncertainty on the slope of these damages. The bigger uncertainty, unfortunately, there's little we can do because it's not going to be resolved, the social part of it. The private one, yes. So thinking about how costly it is to adapt to climate change, you can think of it as being a private response to these changes in the environment. So you can think of it as being uncertainty on the private side. The important part of the framework is on the private side. We put the things that people will be able to respond according to, like moving to different places, like on the cost, within this framework, we put things that will not be resolved when the market happens. So that's the idea. But it's a fuzzy separation. But for the model to work is whatever people already internalize at the point at which you set up the cap and trade, that should be in the private side. Whatever things we cannot control for and we will not be able to credibly measure ex post, then it goes on the social part of it. Okay, there is a paper looking at a couple of papers, at least in the context of economics, who try to think about the costs of adaptation. So I can give you a couple of references. And some of them are very optimistic in saying, look, Arizona used to be very low populated, but we have come up with all these technologies to make it actually feasible to live in New Mexico and Arizona. So why shouldn't we see similar adaptation in other sides of the country? So there's a spectrum of more optimistic, less optimistic papers that will look at different assumptions. Yeah.
So for the cap and trade, it seems like different companies and different industries should get different amount of different fraction of this cap based on what their industry does. Like if it's more damaging or more profitable to the environment or other How do you determine this distribution?
So when we think about industries, the thing with CO2 in particular, it's that it's a global pollutant. This means that more or less we don't care who emits that CO2 because everything goes up in the air. We don't even care which country emits them to first order. So in that sense, from a pure taxing point of view, everyone should pay the same for those emissions. This would be very different, for example, with a NOx, which is a local pollutant that has implications for the local environment, and which actually those local implications can be quite different depending on where you are. And actually NOx programs that regulate NOx will have differentiated costs depending on where the power plants are. So for NOx, for example, it's mostly on the East Coast, and the wind blows in from west to east. So actually, whereas some power plants are covered, the ones that are near the coast are exempt, for example, in Maine, because they are not affecting the forests or the local populations as much as the ones in the Midwest for coal power plants. Now, on the global pollution, as I said, in a perfect world, every local industry will have the same effect on the global environment, the global pollutant. In practice, though, different industries are demanding for different levels of compensation. So if you think a given industry that now has to face these costs for the environment, many of them are asking to be grandfathered. And in that setting, the ones that demand for most compensation are the ones that typically rely most heavily on these CO2 emissions. So when it gets to the politics, different industries demand different compensations. Yeah, okay.
It seems to me that since the social cost is sort of it's varied by the general public, it seems that the money that's paid by these industries should go to the government, so that we all kind of reap the social benefit from it. The cap and trade program, is there a mechanism where the money paid for the permits goes to the government instead of just between the firms?
Yes, definitely. So in the case of California, AB 32, for example, especially for electric utilities, there was a fund, like an auction, where they auctioned the permits. So the firms had to pay for these rights to emit. And those were put, I don't know exact details, but they were put in some sort of a fund where they would be spent towards energy efficiency programs and other policies. Even a rebate. Some of you might have gotten a rebate for the cap and trade program. So it depends a lot on the mechanism. In Europe, for example, in 2005, the electric utilities received all these permits for free. And they didn't think ex ante about the way to recycle those profits. And actually, they made a lot of money. But that was considered kind of a failure of the mechanism. So down the road, they implemented new rules that actually didn't grant all those permits for free. Those windfall profits were seen with some skepticism. Funny thing is that this model would have told them that those windfall profits would be there. So ex ante, I think there could have been much more in improving the design. Some other programs like the California one have seen past experiences and have been able to adapt the design details more properly, yeah. But it's true that's the case. And the issue of distribution, at the end, it's a political decision, yeah. Yes?
So just imagine we have this certain trade mechanism in place, and also this cap and trade mechanism. Say, how do we find out which mechanism is more effective? We have two mechanisms working at the same time. How do we tease out their effects?
So one mechanism is the cap and trade, and the other one?
So cap and trade and permits.
Yes, so usually we will not have them at the same time working together. I say usually because in the UK, for example, they decided to top the cap and trade program with an extra charge because they were very upset about the low prices. It's good. Anyone from the UK here? Yes, good. So usually we only see one in place, either the tax or the cap and trade. And as I mentioned, in the case of any pollutant, in this simplified setting, what we care is about what's the worst. Think about it as what's the worst that can happen. Imagine the problem of fisheries. You can fish in the water, But if you fish too much, it could happen that you completely kill the ecosystem. In that case, it's better to fix a quantity that you can fish, because not fixing the quantity right can be very dangerous. So if you rely on the price and you get it wrong, then it can be that the consequences, you cannot go back to business as usual. In the case of emissions, what we are seeing in practice is that with quantities, with this cap and trade, we are really not getting a price of carbon that makes any sense. It's kind of very volatile, often very low. So there is some sense in putting a price to make it less volatile and more meaningful to the firms that are trying to make investment decisions based on those prices. But there is not consensus when it comes to policy. Yeah. Again, the cap and trade has many nuances, so it's much easier to politically implement it because it's much easier to get everyone on board with particular design issues. So.
One more question.
Yes.
You had your hand up?
Yes.
Oh.
So, you want to auction it off?
Rochambeau.
So how is the slope of the benefit from emissions determined? Is that scientific, or is that kind of an approximation? Or?
Yeah, it's really hard to measure ex ante. This is why it's good to think about it a little bit ex ante to see if we can know is it very steep or not, but this is almost as much as we can know. It's very difficult to measure. In the case of emissions, one way to think about it is to flip it and think about it of not the benefit from polluting, but the cost of reducing that pollution. And then it's much easier. Have any of you seen the McKinsey curve? Yes, it's an abatement curve. How can we reduce emissions? So think about the benefit from polluting, the flip side as being how much does it cost to reduce those emissions, how much does it cost to substitute away from those emissions, and that's much easier to quantify from a bottom-up approach. So we can think about, okay, how can we substitute from coal to gas? How can we substitute from gas to renewables? And that will be the electricity sector. How much energy efficiency gains can we achieve in the buildings? What are the trends that we expect in energy consumption in developing countries, which play a big role? But as you see, as I add more stuff, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier. But the idea is to think about it, I think, more on the cost side than on the benefits. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Omar again for this really nice talk.